green flight of two F-100D Super Sabres from the Silver Knights out of Da Nang orbited 10 miles off the North Vietnamese coast, lugging drop tanks and the rocket pods they'd need on their ResCAP mission. The sky was full of scudding clouds below them at 20,000 feet. A big strike was going in to attack the Dragon's Jaw Bridge, and the AAA was expected to be fierce. Previous missions had also encountered MiGs, although for the most part those had avoided contact. Not today. Suddenly the radio was crowded with frantic calls. Zinc 1 break, there's a MiG on your tail. And then the chilling mayday call and more hasty warnings. The Thuds were being chewed up. 2 minutes later the MIGCAP apparently arrived from its position 60 miles north of the strikers.
Fox 2, Fox 2.
Someone from Purple Flight called out as he fired a sidewinder. Green Flight had no idea whether it hit home or not. They were ordered to fly north and cover a damaged aircraft that was heading back towards them. Moments later, Captain Don Kilgus, flying Green 2, saw something come up out of the haze 90 degrees off his nose. It was a MiG-17, flown by Li Minh Huan of the 921st Fighter Regiment. I'm going to read you Don Kilgus' account in detail because it's really quite unbelievable. He starts out just as he sees the first MiG. The first bogey came out of the haze. At first, we identified it only as an airplane, and then 1001 later, it's a MiG, a bandit. I have never been as impressed in my life as I was at that moment. By the time I saw it was a MiG, it had banked up, and before I could do anything more than turn into him and jettison my tanks, that airplane had turned 90 degrees on me. Absolutely spectacular. Of course, he was light and had his airspeed up high, whereas we were trying to maintain cruise airspeed, which meant we were at about 380 knots. Much lower than we would have liked to be, but you had a trade-off between speed and loiter time, and of course we had to stay up as long as we could, so... But anyway, there are some certain things about air-to-air that don't change, even if you see another airplane of different performance. Because of where he was, I banked into him and I pulled the nose up. Apparently that first airplane turned the 90 degrees and missed me, overshot me. Originally I could see the top of his wings, which meant that I was above him, and I knew it was very unlikely that he'd be able to get onto me. But now he's back at 6 o'clock in the blind spot, so I knew I'd have to hold a hard turn, a defensive turn, 1001, 1002, until I felt he was going to spit out the other side. Then I took the G off the airplane, unloaded is the term, and rolled back the other way, and when I caught sight of him he had overshot and was well out in front, dead behind my unknowing leader, whose option before that had been to lower the nose, light afterburner and try and get separation. But the MiG was now close on his tail. Oh boy, green lead, brake left, you've got a MiG at 2,000 feet. He was close. At that point, I would guess I was about 5,000 feet behind the MiG. I said, I'll get in range. But instinctively, even at that range, I pulled up the nose in front of him and fired just enough so he'd see those 20mm winking. Either the other airplane, the other MiG, saw it, or my MiG saw it. In any case, he instantaneously pulled off green lead. Green lead reverse, 2's on the MiG. I put the afterburner in. He started a slight climb. When he saw I matched it, he just continued to roll right over and went straight down for the Gulf of Tonkin. I paused momentarily, knowing I'm in an advantageous position because I'm above him. I had little time to think. I let him get a bit of separation on me so I could get things collected in my mind, and then I rolled on in. Now I'm going straight down. Glancing at the airspeed indicator, I saw 450 knots in afterburner. Now what's going through the pilot's head? You know what it is? Mass-produced by completely unskilled labour. The analog computer is going clickety-click. This MiG has a lighter wing loading than I do. He's going straight down. He's playing chicken. How far can I go before I have to pull up? Those were the first things going through my mind. The next things going through my mind were... We had everything set up for rockets, that is for rescue, which meant the sight was caged so I could strafe through the pipper. And I had set the reticle diameter so the bottom diamond was a good aiming index for the rockets, and that way you didn't have to change anything. Therefore I had to immediately uncage the sight to get the lead computing gyro working. And the MiG-17 had a 32-foot wingspan, and you need to set the wingspan at 32 feet because there was a very limited range info. And the way you knew it was all working right was if that diameter of the reticle matched the wingtips of the airplane. The range was being computed correctly, and if it wasn't right, then you twisted the throttle grip to vary the diameter of the reticle, and you provided a manual range input. So all of this is going through my mind in a flash. Uncage the sight, take the depression out so it's a free air-to-air sight, set the wingspan lever. And all of this is at the same time you're going straight down and you've shifted to guns and turned the gun switch on hot and all of these other things as you are going through the switchology drill. All the while the mind is saying, where am I going to pull out? And I said, 6,500 feet. I don't know why I picked that. I later went back to the charts and it was about as close to right as you can get. Time blurred. And the next thing I knew was, I'm going straight down, and these gyros don't know what they're doing when you're going straight down because in effect you're at absolutely 0 G, and the sight was floating all over the windscreen and I'm trying to get on the goddamn tail of the MiG, so I did the electrical cage, but it was still drifting a lot. I fired a burst, and now the training comes into play. You got so good on the air-to-air dart in training because everything was so canned and stabilised that you fired short bursts and waited for the little pieces of tinfoil to come off, saving the dart for the guys behind you. So I fired a short burst. Didn't see anything happen. I fired another short burst, and I said, God damn. Then I reached up to recage the sight, so I had a fixed aiming pipper because it was drifting all over from going straight down 0 G. I fired another burst and looked at my altitude of 7,100 feet and said, this may be the last chance I ever have for a MiG. Screw how much ammo it takes, screw everything else. So I just came down on the trigger until I thought I was about 6,500 feet, and I was still firing when I started pulling in the Gs. Just about that time, several things all happened at once. I saw puffs and sparks on the vertical tail of the MiG, and very shortly thereafter I didn't see anything. I didn't black out myself, but let's put it this way, yes, I blacked myself out, and that I had no visibility. I was still conscious. I said, that was stupid, Don. I was still going probably 580 knots in that ballpark. Then instantly I came off the G and started the recovery procedure over again, which was idle, speed brakes. I began to breathe again as I pulled out somewhere between the wave caps. I won't embroider the story by saying I got spray on the windshield, but it was damn close. Kilgus lost sight of the MiG as he pulled out and didn't have the time to search for it. One of the damaged F-105s was now tentatively flying out over the Gulf of Tonkin on its way to Da Nang when the pilot reported the hydraulics had failed and he was going to eject. Green flight repositioned to cover the resulting rescue attempt. Sadly, that effort ended in tragedy. Major Frank Bennett's parachute didn't open properly and he was killed in the ejection. Kilgus flew back to Da Nang. It had been a terrible day for US aviation. Aside from the two F-105s, an A-1 Sky Raider had also been lost. The Dragon's Jaw Bridge remained very much up and functioning. On the Vietnamese side, Li Minh Huan was killed when his MiG-17 crashed into the Gulf of Tonkin. He had taken off at 10:22, fired the shots that ultimately killed Frank Bennett at around 10:31, and was dead by 10:40. Death came incredibly quickly for the VPAF's flyers in the chaotic early days of Rolling Thunder. Two other MiGs from the 921st Fighter Regiment were also lost, either to the F-100s or to their own AA gunners. Vietnamese records are inconclusive. But there's no reason to expect the USAF to know about those two losses. However, for reasons that escape me today, the Tactical Air Force refused to acknowledge Don Kilgus' MiG kill that day. Eventually they allowed a probable, which is what the record still shows as of July 2023. Vietnamese records are clear on the subject, making this the only kill the F-100 scored for the USAF in over 380,000 combat sorties in Vietnam. It was also the first MiG kill of the Vietnam War. Don Kilgus painted a kill marking on his F-100D named K Lin and got on with fighting the war. His combat record during Vietnam is awe-inspiring. He flew at least 5 tours between 1964 and 1972, 2 in the F-100D and then 3 in the F-105F, initially as a forward air controller and then as a wild weasel. In 1970 he covered the Son Tai raid, was shot down and rescued by the Jolly Green Giants. He was awarded the first of his 2 Silver Stars for his skill and bravery on that mission. After the war, he flew the F-4 and the F-15, commanded the 8th Tactical Fighter Squadron, and after a tour in Washington, retired as a colonel in 1985. Sadly, he was killed in an auto accident in 1988. In the heat of the moment, Don Kilgus remembered his training and displayed the technique and aggression of a great fighter pilot. He uses textbook maneuvers to avoid the head-on attacks. When he finds himself on Huan's tail, he is eerily calm. He creates separation, adjusts his gun sight, waits for the right moment. We have to remember that this is a life-and-death situation. Don Kilgus is piloting a temperamental 1950 fighter in a vertical dive and is in his first hostile air-to-air encounter. The entire action he describes happened in 15 to 20 seconds. Huan, on the other hand, seems to panic. Although the Super Sabre is in his rear quarter, the MiG-17 was superior to the F-100 in turn rate and climb rate. Its diving performance was poor and the aircraft was very tricky in that flight regime. Even if he had avoided Kilgus, there was a significant chance he'd plough into the ground anyway. The MiG flight were likely somewhat short on fuel, but they'd been vectored by GCI to intercept the Super Sabre, so presumably they had enough to engage in a turning fight. This was actually an early example of something that comes through in much of the historical text about the early phase of Rolling Thunder. Despite the well-publicized lack of air-to-air training and the poor performance of their missiles, the average US aviator was significantly more skilled than their Vietnamese counterpart. He was better trained and had a lot more flight hours. The Vietnamese flyers were brave and some would prove to be highly capable, but it was their ground controllers and radar coverage that made the VPAF so dangerous. But it would not be the Super Sabre that would face them from this point on. This engagement was seen as final proof that the F-100 was not agile enough and not fast enough to counter the MiG-17. A somewhat surprising conclusion given that the MiG came from a previous generation of fighters. In truth, the USAF was itching to deploy its latest fighter into the conflict. F-4C Phantoms would fly their first missions the next day and take on all USAF MIGCAP sorties from then on. One of the great aviation matchups was about to begin.